The bullet was never meant to miss. It was calculated, timed, and aimed at the future of a crime empire, a 6-year-old boy standing beside the most dangerous man in New York. The city's underworld had already decided who would die that night. But fate made a mistake. The bullet didn't hit the air. It didn't hit the king. It hit the waitress. She wasn't armed. She wasn't protected. She didn't even know his name until minutes earlier. Yet when the gun appeared across the street, she ran toward it instead of away. 30 seconds later, blood soaked the pavement. 30 seconds later, a mafia boss known for ending lives with a phone call was kneeling in the street, shaking. And 30 seconds later, as sirens screamed and guns were drawn, the woman dying in his arms asked only one question. Are the children safe? That was the moment everything broke. Because in Lorenzo Duca's world, no one takes a bullet for free. The bullet was never supposed to hesitate. It had a destination, a purpose, a future already written into its trajectory. In the quiet arithmetic of the underworld, the equation was simple: one child removed, one empire weakened, one crown ready to fall, no variables, no mercy, and absolutely no room for a woman named Sophie Vance. If anyone had reviewed the plan after the fact, they would have noticed the flaw immediately. Not in the angle of the shot, nor the timing, nor the clean, professional distance between the gray sedan and the curb. The flaw was human. The flaw was a waitress who happened to look up at the wrong second. Sophie had been on her feet for 9 hours straight, her calves burning, her smile held together by habit and necessity. The gilded fork glittered the way expensive places always did, soft lighting, polished silverware, the low murmur of conversations that never worried about rent being 3 days late. To Sophie, it was just another shift. Another night of counting tips in her head and calculating which bill could wait another week. She remembered noticing the man at table 12 because the room changed around him. Sound seemed to dull near his booth, like the restaurant itself was holding its breath. Lorenzo Duca sat with the posture of someone who had never learned how to relax, his tailored suit sharp enough to cut. Across from him, 2 identical 6-year-old boys swung their legs under the table, their miniature jackets already wrinkled, their faces caught somewhere between boredom and quiet fear. Sophie had approached with water, careful, professional. She had seen powerful men before: bankers, politicians, men who liked to feel important for 2 hours over dinner. Lorenzo Duca was different. He wasn't performing authority. He simply carried it, the way gravity carries weight. She hadn't known his name then, only that his eyes were cold and watchful, and that when one of the boys frowned at his plate, Lorenzo's jaw tightened like he was facing a problem he couldn't solve with force. That moment should have ended there. A polite nod. A refill. A step back into the noise of the dining room. Fate, however, has a talent for rearranging endings. When Sophie stepped outside minutes later, clutching the leather check folder to thank the man for a tip large enough to feel unreal, the night air felt sharp in her lungs. The city hummed, indifferent. Valet lights reflected off black paint and chrome. Lorenzo stood near the curb, adjusting one boy's coat while the other leaned against his side, small fingers gripping expensive fabric. It was then Sophie saw the window roll down across the street. Not all the way, just enough. Metal caught the streetlight. Time did not slow the way people claim it does in moments like these. It narrowed. Everything else, the sound of traffic, the laughter behind her, the music bleeding from the restaurant, fell away, leaving only a clean, terrifying clarity. Sophie saw the barrel. She saw the direction. She saw that no one else was looking the right way. Not the guards, not the father, not the children. She did not think about consequences. She did not think about heroism. She thought only of the weight of 2 small bodies she had just joked with over fancy nuggets and broccoli trees. Her feet moved before fear could argue. She ran toward the danger. Her scream cut through the night, raw and instinctive. But the shot was faster. The impact hit her like a hammer between the shoulder and spine, a brutal force that drove the air from her lungs as she collided with the boys, and the pavement swallowed them all. Pain followed a heartbeat later, white, blinding, absolute. Chaos erupted. Gunfire answered gunfire. Men shouted. Tires screamed. The gray sedan vanished into the arteries of the city as if it had never been there at all. Lorenzo reacted the way he always did: fast, lethal, precise. His weapon was in his hand before rage could finish rising in his chest. He fired, controlled and furious, but the target was already gone. The street fell into a stunned, ringing silence, broken only by the sound of a child crying. "Papa!" The word sliced deeper than any bullet ever had. Lorenzo turned back, heart slamming against his ribs, expecting blood where it did not belong. The boys were shaking, terrified, but alive. The red soaking their clothes was not theirs. It was hers. She lay sprawled on the concrete, her body curved around his son's like a shield, her white blouse darkening rapidly. Her face was pale, lashes fluttering, lips parted as if she were trying to remember how to breathe. For the first time in years, Lorenzo Duca dropped to his knees in the street. He had seen death in every form imaginable. He had ordered it, witnessed it, lived beside it long enough that it no longer surprised him. But this was wrong in a way his world did not account for. Civilians did not take bullets meant for his bloodline. Women like her did not insert themselves into wars they could not survive. He pressed his hands to the wound, feeling the warmth of her blood seep between his fingers, feeling something dangerously close to panic claw its way up his spine. Sirens wailed in the distance. His men hovered, waiting for orders he did not immediately give. Her eyes opened. They were amber, unfocused but fierce in their insistence on staying open. She coughed, a wet, painful sound, and her fingers curled weakly against his wrist. "Hey," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "Stay with me. Look at me." Her gaze found his, briefly, as if she were anchoring herself to the darkest thing in the room. Her lips moved. The boys," she whispered, each word dragged from somewhere deep and fragile. "Are they hurt?" The question landed harder than the bullet ever had. Not her pain, not her fear, not even her life. Lorenzo leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "They're safe," he said. "Because of you." A faint smile touched her mouth, more relief than joy. Her eyelids fluttered again. "Good," she breathed. "That's good." Something fractured inside him then, quiet but irreversible. He had built an empire on the assumption that everyone had a price, that loyalty was purchased, fear was enforced, and sacrifice was always transactional. Yet here she was, bleeding out on cold pavement, having asked for nothing in return. As medics finally rushed in, Lorenzo did something no one in his organization had ever seen him do. He gathered her into his arms himself, ignoring the blood soaking into his suit, ignoring the way his hands trembled around her weightless body. He did not hand her over to the city. He did not trust the randomness of sirens and protocols and chance. "Take us to St. Jude's," he ordered the driver as the convoy surged forward, red lights bleeding into the night. "Call every favor. Wake every doctor." If she dies, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. As Manhattan blurred past, Lorenzo looked down at the woman who had never been part of the plan, her blood staining his shirt, her life resting dangerously close to slipping away. For the first time in a very long time, the future felt uncertain. And uncertainty, he realized, terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Because the war that had just begun was not only for his territory, it was for the life of the woman who had taken a bullet meant for his sons and for the part of his soul he did not yet understand she had already touched. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. Sophie did not wake all at once. Consciousness returned to her in fragments, sound before sight, pressure before pain. The steady beep of a heart monitor cut through the darkness, slow and insistent, like a reminder she had not yet been allowed to leave. Her throat burned. Her shoulder felt heavy, distant, as though it belonged to someone else. When she finally opened her eyes, white filled her vision. Not the soft white of morning, but the clinical brightness of a room designed to observe weakness. The smell of antiseptic settled into her lungs. For a moment, panic surged, sharp and immediate. Her body tried to move and failed. "Easy," the voice came from her left, low, controlled, male. Sophie turned her head slightly, wincing as pain bloomed along her shoulder. The man standing beside her bed was not a doctor. He was too still, too alert. An earpiece curved behind his ear, and his hand rested casually near the outline of a weapon beneath his jacket. Her heart stuttered. "Where am I?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin, like it had traveled too far to reach her. "Safe," the man replied. Then, after a pause, "For now." That was not comforting. Before she could form another question, the door opened without ceremony. The room seemed to tighten around itself as Lorenzo Duca stepped inside. He did not look like the man kneeling in the street hours earlier. His suit had been changed, dark and immaculate. His hair perfectly in place. Only his eyes betrayed him shadowed, sharp, carrying a tension that did not soften when they found her awake. The doctor trailing behind him began to speak, words tumbling out about surgery, clean extraction, luck. Lorenzo lifted a hand. The doctor fell silent and left, closing the door behind him with a precision that suggested long practice. They were alone. Sophie became acutely aware of the machines. The IV taped to her arm, the faint tug of stitches beneath the bandage on her shoulder. She swallowed. "The boys," she said, "are they... They're unharmed," Lorenzo interrupted, his tone clipped, almost impatient. "They're asleep. Under guard." Relief loosened something in her chest. Only then did the weight of what had happened begin to settle, heavy and undeniable. She had been shot. She was in a room guarded by armed men, and the most dangerous man she had ever encountered was standing less than a meter from her bed. "Why am I here?" she asked quietly. Lorenzo studied her for a long moment, as if recalibrating. "Because leaving you anywhere else would be irresponsible." That's not an answer. A flicker of something surprise perhaps crossed his face. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not from a hospital bed. "You were targeted," he said. "Whether intentionally or as collateral, no longer matters. You are connected now. That makes you vulnerable." Sophie absorbed this slowly. Connected. The word settled uneasily in her mind. "I didn't ask for that." "No," he said. "You didn't." There was a beat of silence. In it, Sophie noticed details she had missed before the faint scar near his temple. The way his hands remained loose but ready. The careful distance he kept from the bed, as if proximity itself were a risk. "You saved my sons," he continued, his voice lower now. "People don't do that without reason." Her brows drew together. "I did it because they're children." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "That is not a reason that survives in my world." "Well," she replied, a trace of exhaustion seeping into her tone. "Maybe your world needs better reasons." The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Lorenzo should have ended the conversation there. He should have dismissed her remark as naivete, the kind that gets people killed. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest, an irritation sharpened by an unwilling respect. "You don't understand what you stepped into," he said. "I understand enough," Sophie replied. "I understand that someone tried to kill a child. I understand that you're powerful enough that it didn't surprise anyone. And I understand that if I hadn't been there, you'd be standing in this room alone right now." Her breath hitched, but she did not look away. Lorenzo's gaze darkened. He turned slightly, signaling to the man by the door. "Leave us." The guard hesitated for half a second, then obeyed. When the door shut, the room felt smaller. "You're frightened," Lorenzo said, "not unkindly." "Yes," Sophie answered, "but not of you." That finally startled him. She shifted carefully, grimacing as pain reminded her of its presence. "I'm frightened of what comes next, of waking up one day and realizing I don't recognize my life anymore." "You won't," he said immediately. She met his eyes. "You can't promise that." He did not respond. Promises were dangerous things. Minutes later, as night pressed against the windows and the machines continued their quiet vigil, Sophie closed her eyes again, exhaustion dragging her under. Lorenzo remained where he was, watching her breathe, the rise and fall of her chest steady but fragile. He had ordered protection details, rerouted traffic, silenced half the city to ensure her survival. None of it eased the weight settling into him. Because for the first time, someone had crossed into his world without fear or ambition, and left a mark he could not simply erase. When Sophie slept, Lorenzo finally turned away. Outside the room, he spoke in low, lethal tones into his phone. Names were exchanged. Decisions made. The city would not sleep that night. And neither, he realized, would he... Sophie woke to silence so complete it felt artificial. Not the gentle quiet of early morning, but the curated stillness of a place where noise had been decided against. Light filtered through sheer curtains, pale and coastal, unfamiliar. For a few disoriented seconds, she thought she was still dreaming. Then she tried to sit up, and pain answered for her. Her shoulder throbbed in deep, measured pulses, reminding her of everything her mind had briefly attempted to forget. She was not in a hospital room anymore. The bed beneath her was wide and impossibly soft. The air smelled faintly of salt and clean linen. Beyond the glass doors at the far end of the room, the ocean stretched out in muted blues and silvers, calm to the point of indifference. Sophie lay back, heart tightening. Someone had moved her, not transferred, relocated. When she finally gathered the strength to stand, she discovered the room had no locks on the inside. The door opened easily into a corridor flooded with natural light. At the end of it stood two men in suits, both alert, both unmistakably armed. Her stomach dropped. "Good morning, Miss Vance," one of them said politely, as if she were a guest instead of a variable under watch. You shouldn't be walking yet. Where am I? She asked. Hamptons, he replied. Private residence. She did not need to ask whose. Breakfast appeared without her requesting it. Medication was delivered with gentle insistence. Her phone sat on the bedside table, charged but stripped of any signal beyond emergency calls. When she asked about leaving, the answer was always the same. Not yet. By the third day, fear had evolved into something sharper. She was not restrained. She was accommodated. The house was beautiful, immaculate, stocked with everything she might need. Clothes appeared in her size. Books she might enjoy were placed casually on side tables. Even the view felt chosen, positioned to soothe. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Sophie found Lorenzo on the terrace just after sunset. He stood with his back to the house, jacket off, sleeves rolled, staring out at the water as if the horizon were something he could negotiate with. You moved me, she said. Yes. You didn't ask. No. The honesty cut deeper than an excuse would have. I want to go home, she continued, keeping her voice steady. This isn't protection. It's confinement. Lorenzo turned then, his expression controlled but strained. Your apartment has already been compromised. Your workplace is under investigation. You don't have a home that's safe anymore. That doesn't give you the right to decide my life. It gives me the responsibility, he countered. Whether you like it or not, you're a loose end in a situation that doesn't forgive them. Sophie laughed softly, the sound brittle. I didn't realize saving 2 children came with a lifetime contract. His gaze sharpened. You think this is about gratitude? I think it's about control, she said. And I think you're so used to it, you don't see where it ends. For a moment, something dangerous flickered across his face. Anger? Yes, but beneath it, something else. Uncertainty. You are alive because I intervened, he said. And I almost died because of you, she replied. The words landed between them. Undeniable. Lorenzo exhaled slowly, as though restraining an instinct. You don't understand the forces at play. Then explain them to me, Sophie said. Instead of locking me inside a beautiful cage and calling it care. Silence stretched. The sea whispered against the shore. You don't belong in this world, Lorenzo said finally. Quieter now. People like me don't brush against ordinary lives without consequences. Her eyes softened, just slightly. Maybe that's the problem. You think I'm ordinary because I don't scare easily. He held her gaze longer than was comfortable. She did not look away. That night, Sophie slept poorly. She dreamed of narrow streets and open hands, of running toward something she couldn't quite see. When she woke, there were voices downstairs, lighter ones, children's voices. She followed the sound and found the twins in the living room, sprawled on the rug with a puzzle scattered between them. One looked up and grinned when he saw her. You're awake, he said simply, as if her presence made sense. The other frowned in concentration. Papa said you'd be better today. The casual certainty of it caught her off guard. Lorenzo stood a few steps behind them, watching carefully, as though this moment required supervision. Sophie knelt slowly, her shoulder protesting, and helped them fit 2 pieces together. You didn't leave. One boy said. I didn't, she answered, surprised to find the truth steadier than she expected. Later, alone again, the weight of her situation returned. But it had shifted. This was no longer just about her safety. It was about proximity, about the quiet way Lorenzo observed her with his children, as if trying to solve a problem that defied logic. That evening, her phone buzzed once, a missed call notification. Her old manager? The name sent a chill through her. When she showed Lorenzo, something in him went very still. You haven't told anyone where you are, he said. No, she replied. But someone knew I was gone. That night. As security quietly doubled and whispers moved through the house like shadows, Sophie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She had stepped out of the line of fire, but not out of the war. And for the first time, she wondered whether the most dangerous thing about staying was not the enemies outside the gates, but the man who had built them and was slowly, deliberately, letting her see what lay beyond. The first scream came just after midnight. It sliced through the quiet house with a sharpness that sent Sophie upright in bed before her mind fully woke. For a split second, she thought it was memory, a dream echoing the sound of gunfire, of chaos bleeding into sleep. Then she heard it again, a child's voice this time, raw with fear. She didn't wait. Ignoring the protest of her shoulder, Sophie swung her feet onto the floor and followed the sound down the hallway. The house was dim, lit only by recessed lights that cast long shadows along the walls. Somewhere behind her, a door opened. Somewhere else, footsteps moved with trained precision. But Sophie reached the boys' room first. One of the twins was sitting upright in bed, breath coming in short, panicked bursts. His hands clenched in the sheets as though the fabric were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The other was crying openly, his small body curled inward, eyes squeezed shut. "They're here!" The first boy gasped. "They're coming back!" Sophie crossed the room without hesitation and knelt beside the bed. "No," she said softly, firmly. "No one's here." His eyes darted to the corners of the room. "Searching. I heard it. The noise. I know," she replied. "Night makes everything louder. It lies to you." She placed her hand gently over his, grounding, steady. The crying slowed, though it didn't stop. Behind her, Lorenzo stood in the doorway. He hadn't changed for sleep. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his expression unreadable. But Sophie could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze swept the room with a soldier's instinct. He had arrived with guards, strategy, power, and none of it mattered in this moment. "They won't sleep," he said quietly. Sophie looked up at him. Then they shouldn't be alone. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of fact. Lorenzo hesitated, just long enough to reveal uncertainty, then nodded once. The guards withdrew, closing the door behind them. The room felt smaller, more human. Sophie climbed onto the edge of the bed, careful of her injury. She guided the boys closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Do you know what helps when your mind won't stop?" she asked. Both shook their heads. "Stories," she said. "Not scary ones. Ones where nothing bad happens." The first boy sniffed. "Papa doesn't tell stories." Lorenzo stiffened slightly. Sophie did not look at him. "That's okay," she said. "I do." She began with something simple, a memory of summers spent watching the sky change colors, of counting clouds and naming them. Her voice was low, rhythmic, unconcerned with impressing. She described details that asked nothing of them except to listen. Gradually, the boys' breathing slowed. Their grip on the sheets loosened. One of them yawned. Lorenzo watched from the corner, arms crossed, his face betraying nothing. Inside, something shifted. He had hired professionals, specialists. None of them had achieved this. Sophie finished the story and brushed a hand through one boy's hair. "Try sleeping now," she murmured. "I'll be right here. You promised," the other asked, already half asleep. "I promise." Minutes passed. Then more. Eventually, both boys drifted off, their faces soft and unguarded. Sophie stayed where she was. She felt Lorenzo's presence before he spoke. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," she said quietly. "I did." He considered her in silence. The room was filled with the gentle sound of children breathing, steady and untroubled. "They haven't slept like this since their mother died," he admitted. The words carried weight, loss, long carried and rarely named. Sophie looked at him then. "You can't fight nightmares," she said. "Not with weapons. I fight everything with weapons," he replied. "Not this." Something in her tone, gentle but unyielding, made him listen. When Sophie finally stood to leave, her knees protested, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding herself together until she let go. Lorenzo stepped aside to let her pass. As she did, he spoke again. "You should rest. So should you." She walked back toward her room, unaware of the way he watched her go, as though committing the moment to memory. The second night, it happened again. This time, Sophie didn't wait for the screams. She sensed it, the restlessness moving through the house like a storm building pressure. She found the boys awake but silent, eyes wide, listening for dangers that weren't there. She sat with them on the floor, her back against the bed, and let them lean into her. She taught them how to breathe slowly, how to imagine safe places that couldn't be broken into. Lorenzo observed from the doorway, saying nothing. By the third night, the boys called for her by name. That was when the truth settled fully into Sophie's chest. She was no longer a guest, no longer an accident. She had become something woven into the fabric of the house, quiet but essential. Later, when the boys were asleep again, Sophie found Lorenzo in the kitchen, standing alone in the low light. "You let them see you now," she said softly. He didn't deny it. "You make it easier." The admission was small. It was everything. Outside, the ocean moved endlessly, indifferent to guilt and redemption alike. Inside, a fragile peace had formed, not because the danger was gone, but because someone had chosen to stay awake through it. And for the first time since the night of the bullet, Sophie realized that what frightened her most was no longer the walls or the guards, but the growing sense that she was becoming indispensable in a world that devoured what it needed. A world that, slowly and against its nature, was beginning to need her. The house did not sleep the way it once had. Even when the lights were low and the corridors quiet, something restless moved beneath the surface, an awareness that danger had not retreated, only repositioned itself. Sophie felt it in the way guards shifted posts without explanation, in the sudden tightening of schedules, in the silence that followed whispered phone calls Lorenzo took behind closed doors. It was the fourth morning when the truth finally reached her. She was in the sitting room with the boys, helping them build a lopsided tower from wooden blocks, when Lorenzo's head of security appeared at the door. He did not look at her. He did not look at the children. He spoke only to Lorenzo, his voice low but urgent. "We have confirmation," he said. The order didn't come from outside. The room seemed to hold its breath. Sophie's hands stilled mid-motion. One of the boys frowned. Papa Lorenzo knelt beside them, steady and composed in a way that felt practiced. "Go finish your game in the other room," he said gently. "We'll be there soon." They obeyed without argument, their trust uncomplicated and complete. When they were gone, the door closed softly behind them. "What does that mean?" Sophie asked. Lorenzo did not answer immediately. He crossed to the window, his back to her, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond the glass. When he spoke, his voice was controlled to the point of coldness. "It means the person who wanted my son dead shares my blood." The words landed with brutal clarity. Sophie's stomach tightened. "Your family." "A cousin," he said. "Someone who believes succession should be forced, not inherited." "And the man in the car she pressed, the shooter, disposable," Lorenzo replied. "He was never meant to survive the night." Sophie wrapped her arms around herself. The distance between theory and reality collapsed in on her. This wasn't abstract danger. It was intimate, intentional, calculated. "And me?" she asked quietly. "Why was I shot?" Lorenzo turned to face her then. For the first time since she had known him, something unguarded showed through anger, sharpened by something dangerously close to guilt. "You weren't," he said. "You were collateral." The word cut deep. Sophie looked away, the room suddenly too bright. "Someone pulled the trigger knowing children were there," she said. "Knowing civilians were there." "Yes. And you still call this a world that can be managed?" His silence was answer enough. The next revelation came hours later. Sophie's phone, still restricted to emergency use, buzzed once while she sat alone in the library. A name flashed across the screen, one she had not seen since before the night everything changed. Mark Feldman, her former manager. Her pulse spiked. She stared at the screen, unease creeping in like cold water. She hadn't told anyone where she was. She hadn't even known herself until waking up in this house. When she showed the phone to Lorenzo, the change in him was immediate. Something inside him went very still, very sharp. "He shouldn't know you're alive," he said. "He shouldn't know anything." Sophie replied, "I quit that job weeks ago." Lorenzo took the phone, already signaling to his security team. Instructions were given in clipped phrases, locations requested, timelines cross-checked. When he turned back to her, his expression had darkened. "He placed the call to tip off my cousin's men. He said, he confirmed my sons would be present." The room tilted. "He knew," Sophie whispered. "He knew I'd be there." "Yes." The betrayal settled into her bones slowly, heavily. Mark had smiled at her every shift, had complained about staffing shortages, joked about tips, asked her how she was holding up after her mother died. And all the while, he had been selling information that nearly got 2 children killed. Nearly got her killed. "I need to leave," Sophie said suddenly. "I can't be here when this comes down on you." Lorenzo's gaze locked onto hers. "You won't be safer outside these walls. At least it would be my choice." She shot back. For a long moment, they stood facing each other, tension stretched thin and trembling. Then Lorenzo did something unexpected. He stepped back. "I won't stop you," he said. The words stunned her. "I can't protect you if you walk away," he continued. "But I won't cage you to keep my conscience clean." Sophie searched his face, looking for manipulation, for calculation. She found none, only restraint. That night, she packed slowly, methodically. Each item she folded felt like a decision weighed and measured. She paused at the door, listening to the quiet hum of the house, to the distant sound of the boys laughing over a game. When she stepped into the hallway, Lorenzo was there. "If you go," he said, You won't be able to pretend this never happened. She met his eyes. I already can't. They stood like that, two people suspended between choice and consequence. Outside, engines started, orders were given. Somewhere beyond the gates, someone would die before sunrise. Sophie thought of the bullet, of the way she hadn't hesitated. I'm not staying because I'm fearless, she said finally. I'm staying because I refuse to let fear decide for me. Lorenzo nodded once. Respect flickered there, sharp and undeniable. Behind them, the house remained silent. Ahead of them, war was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. And this time, Sophie understood. She was no longer an accident in its path, but a witness to its truth. The rain began without warning, a sudden, relentless curtain that blurred the world beyond the windows and pressed the night closer to the house. Sophie watched it fall from the sitting room, her reflection faint against the glass, her thoughts tangled in the quiet aftermath of decisions she could no longer undo. She had chosen to stay. Not because she believed she was safe, not because she trusted the walls or the men guarding them. She stayed because leaving would have meant running from a truth already lodged too deeply inside her to escape. The truth that the bullet had not only changed her life, it had aligned it with his. Lorenzo found her there just after midnight. He moved without sound, as he always did. But she sensed him before she saw him. There was a gravity to his presence, a pressure in the air that shifted when he entered a room. You should be resting, he said. So should you, she replied, echoing words she had spoken nights earlier. He did not argue this time. They stood facing each other, the space between them filled with rain and unspoken tension. The house was unusually quiet. The boys had finally fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep. The war outside its gates had paused, if only briefly, to gather breath. I owe you the truth, Lorenzo said at last. Sophie did not move. I think you already know I can handle it. He studied her for a moment, as if recalibrating the weight of what he was about to give her. Then he gestured toward the chair across from him. When she sat, carefully, he remained standing, his hands resting lightly on the back of the opposite chair, as though grounding himself. My wife died 8 years ago, he began. Not to a rival, not to a bullet, to something quieter, addiction, despair. His jaw tightened. I didn't save her. Sophie's chest ached at the simplicity of the confession. Loss stripped of drama was often the most devastating kind. When she died, I learned a lesson the world was eager to teach. He continued, love is a liability. Mercy is an opening. Anything soft will be used against you. He lifted his gaze to meet hers. So I became what the world expected. A monster. He didn't say the word aloud. He didn't have to. I don't kill for pleasure, Lorenzo said, but I don't hesitate. I don't forgive. And I don't pretend the blood on my hands belongs to anyone else. Sophie absorbed each sentence, feeling the weight of it settle around them. Why tell me this now? Because you're standing too close to the fire, he replied, and because you deserve to know exactly what you're choosing. Outside, thunder rolled, distant but unmistakable. I can't give you safety, Lorenzo went on. Not the kind that lets you forget danger exists. I can't promise you peace. I can only promise you truth, and the certainty that anyone who tries to harm you will not survive the attempt. Sophie stood slowly, her movements careful but deliberate. You think I don't already see the darkness, she asked. I was shot in the street, betrayed by someone I trusted. I wake up every morning knowing my life can end because someone else decided it should. She stepped closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes. What you don't see is that you're not the only one who carries damage. Lorenzo's breath hitched, barely perceptible. You protect your sons with violence, she continued softly. I protect them with presence. We're not opposites. We're parallel. The words seemed to strike something inside him. I don't want you to be part of this, he said, more quietly now. Not truly, because once you are, there's no undoing it. Sophie reached out before she could overthink it, her fingers brushing his wrist. The contact was light, tentative, but Lorenzo froze as though she had touched something exposed. I'm already part of it, she said. I just won't become what you fear. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain battered the windows, insistent, unrelenting. Finally, Lorenzo pulled his hand back, not in rejection, but restraint. You should hate me, he said. I don't, she replied. That frightened him more than hatred ever could. Later that night, Sophie lay awake in bed, the conversation replaying in fragments. Monster, truth, choice, each word echoed, settling into new shapes as she turned them over in her mind. She wondered how many nights Lorenzo had spent alone with those same thoughts, sharpening himself against them until there was nothing left that could cut. Down the hall, Lorenzo stood outside his son's room, listening to their breathing. He had told Sophie the truth because he believed it would push her away, because honesty, in his experience, rarely invited closeness. It had done the opposite. When the call came sharp, urgent, pulling him back into the mechanics of war, he answered without hesitation. Orders were given, a location confirmed, a name marked. But as he ended the call, his gaze drifted once more toward the room where Sophie slept. For the first time in years, Lorenzo Duca hesitated. Not because he doubted his course, but because he understood that whatever happened next would not only define the future of his empire, it would define the man he would have to become in order to deserve the woman who had seen his darkness and chosen not to turn away. And that, he realized, was a far more dangerous reckoning than any enemy waiting in the rain. The first alarm never sounded. That was how Sophie knew something was wrong. She woke to absence, to a silence too complete, stripped of the quiet rhythms she had grown used to. No distant footsteps, no low murmur of guards changing shifts. Even the ocean outside seemed to have paused, as if the night itself were listening. Then the lights went out, not all at once. One wing of the house sank into darkness, followed by another, like a breath being slowly stolen. Sophie sat up, heart hammering, her hand instinctively going to her shoulder as pain flared in response to fear. A second later, the emergency lights failed. That was when the sound came, glass shattering. Not close, but not far enough. Sophie was on her feet before her mind caught up, adrenaline overriding pain. She reached the hallway just as Lorenzo emerged from the opposite end, already armed, already transformed. Whatever softness had crept into him over the past days vanished, replaced by a lethal focus. "Stay in your room," he ordered. "No," she said immediately. He didn't argue. There was no time. The house erupted into controlled chaos. Shouted commands. The thud of boots. The metallic snap of weapons being readied. Somewhere below them, gunfire cracked sharp, brutal, final. They cut the perimeter. One of the guards reported over comms. Multiple entry points. Lorenzo's jaw clenched. "They're not here for me," he said. "They're here for the boys." Sophie felt the truth of it land hard in her chest. "Take them to the safe room," Lorenzo ordered. "Now." He turned to go, but Sophie caught his arm. "I know the house," she said. "The service corridors, the back staircases. I can get them there faster." He looked at her like he was about to refuse. Then another shot rang out. Closer this time. "Fine," he snapped. "You don't leave my sight." They reached the boys' room in seconds. The twins were awake, terror wide in their eyes, already scrambling from bed. "They're back," one whispered, voice shaking. Sophie dropped to her knees, forcing calm into her tone. "No," she said firmly. "Not tonight." She took their hands, steady, grounding. "Follow me. Don't let go." They moved through the house as if it had become something alive and hostile, its familiar halls twisted by shadow and noise. Sophie led them down a narrow service staircase rarely used, her breath shallow, her focus absolute. Lorenzo stayed behind them, a shield made of bone and will, firing with terrifying precision whenever a threat appeared. They reached the safe room just as an explosion rocked the west wing. Dust rained from the ceiling. One of the boys cried out. Sophie pulled them into her, wrapping her body around theirs instinctively, shielding even as fear tore through her. The door sealed with a heavy, mechanical finality. Inside, the room was small but fortified. Reinforced walls, no windows. A single light flickered on, bathing them in pale safety. "You stay here," Lorenzo said to the boys, crouching to their level. His voice softened, though his eyes never stopped tracking the threat beyond the door. "No matter what you hear?" They nodded, clinging to Sophie as if she were an anchor. Lorenzo stood, already turning back toward the war. "Wait," Sophie said. He stopped. For a heartbeat. The world narrowed to the space between them, the echo of gunfire muffled by steel, the scent of smoke, the weight of everything unsaid. "You come back," she said. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. Something flickered across his face, surprise. Then resolve. "I will." He left without another word. Minutes blurred into something indistinct. Sophie sat on the floor with the boys, her back against the wall, every muscle tense. She counted breaths, told quiet stories, lied beautifully about heroes and monsters and endings where everyone survived. Outside, the house screamed. She heard men shouting, heard bodies fall, heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to breach the safe room door. Sophie's pulse roared in her ears. Then it stopped. Silence returned, not gentle, but heavy. The door opened. Sophie surged to her feet just as Lorenzo stepped inside, blood on his knuckles, his shirt torn, his eyes burning with something darker than rage. He was alive. That was all that mattered. "They're gone," he said. The boys broke from Sophie and threw themselves into his arms. He held them tightly, fiercely, as if afraid letting go would invite the world to try again. Only when they were settled, sedated by exhaustion and relief, did Sophie finally let herself breathe. Later, in the wreckage of the house, Sophie found Lorenzo alone in the study. The windows were shattered, rain drifting in, soaking the floor. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "They won't." She stepped closer. "Then neither will I." He turned, searching her face for hesitation. He found none. "You saved them tonight," he said. "You saved me?" Sophie shook her head. "I didn't save you. I stood with you." The distinction mattered. Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving behind a city that would wake to rumors and blood and unanswered questions. Inside, amid broken glass and ruined walls, something irreversible had taken shape. The house had been breached. The illusion of control shattered. But in its place stood something stronger than walls, something neither of them had planned for, and neither could now walk away from. The war was no longer coming. It had arrived. Morning arrived without ceremony. The house stood in the pale aftermath of violence, windows boarded, scorch marks still dark against white walls, the smell of smoke clinging stubbornly to the air. Guards moved quietly through the corridors, their presence efficient but subdued, as if the building itself were recovering from a wound too deep to ignore. Sophie watched the ocean from the terrace, a cup of untouched tea cooling between her hands. The night replayed in fragments. She could not silence the weight of the boys clinging to her, the sound of gunfire reverberating through hallways that had once felt safe. The moment Lorenzo walked back into the room alive, relief had come later. Shock had come first. Behind her, footsteps approached. She did not turn. She knew who it was. "You didn't sleep," Lorenzo said. "Neither did you." He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him despite the cool breeze. His injuries had been treated, his movements controlled but restrained by bruises he had not acknowledged. He looked older in the daylight, stripped of the night's adrenaline, the cost of leadership etched plainly across his face. "I'm moving them," he said after a moment. "Another house, smaller, easier to defend." The boys Sophie asked. "Yes, and me." The question escaped before she could soften it. Lorenzo hesitated. "I won't decide that for you," he said carefully. The words surprised her more than anything else he could have said. Sophie finally turned to face him. "You already have," she replied. "Everything about this situation was decided long before I knew what was happening. That was before," he said. "Last night changed things." She searched his expression, looking for manipulation, for strategy masquerading as freedom. She found none, only restraint, deliberate and unfamiliar. "I won't trap you here," Lorenzo continued. "Not after what you saw. Not after what you did. If you leave, I'll ensure you disappear completely. New identity, distance, safety. And if I stay?" she asked quietly. His jaw tightened. "Then you stay with open eyes." The space he left in the sentence was heavy with implication. Danger. Blood. Consequences he would not soften for her sake. Sophie looked past him, toward the distant line where sea met sky. She thought of the life she'd had before the narrow apartment, the exhaustion, the way the world had felt small and unyielding. She had survived it. She could return to it. But survival was no longer the same as living. "I need time," she said. "You have it." They parted without resolution. That, Sophie realized, was its own kind of mercy. Later, she found the boys in the temporary playroom set up away from the damaged wing. They sat side by side, quietly assembling a model ship, their movements careful, subdued. When they saw her, their faces lit with relief that felt dangerously close to dependence. "You're still here," one said. "For now," she replied, smiling softly. The other frowned. "Are we leaving?" "Yes," Sophie said. "Soon." "Will you come with us?" the first asked. The question landed gently and devastated her all the same. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. That night, Sophie packed again. This time, it felt different. The room no longer resembled a cage. It was simply a place she occupied by choice, at least for the moment. She folded her clothes slowly, deliberately, pausing often to listen to the house settle around her. When she stepped into the hallway, suitcase in hand, Lorenzo was there. "I thought you might leave tonight," he said. "So did I." They stood facing each other, the silence charged but not hostile. "You're afraid," he said. "Yes," Sophie replied, "but not of what you think." "Then tell me." "I'm afraid that if I walk away now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering who I abandoned when things became inconvenient." Something shifted in Lorenzo's gaze, subtle but unmistakable. "I won't ask you to stay," he said. "I know." She moved past him, then stopped. "But you also won't ask me to go." "No," he admitted. "I won't." That was the truth between them, clean, dangerous, undeniable. Sophie returned the suitcase to the room. She did not unpack it. She left it where it was, a reminder that choice remained hers. When she lay down that night, sleep came slowly. She dreamed of open doors and roads that forked endlessly, each path demanding something different from her. When she woke before dawn, she knew only one thing with certainty. She was not finished here. In the study, Lorenzo stood alone, staring at a map lit with discrete markers and coded names. Strategy waited. War demanded attention. Yet his thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the hallway where Sophie's door remained closed but present. He had given her space, and in doing so, he had risked losing her. Strangely, the thought did not weaken him. It sharpened something essential. For the first time, Lorenzo Duca understood that control was not the same as strength, and that the woman walking freely through his world was far more powerful than any he had ever caged. Outside, the ocean remained unchanged. Inside, a decision had begun to take shape, not yet spoken, not yet sealed, but inevitable. Because some bonds are not forged in promises or fear, they are born in the quiet moment when someone is free to leave, and chooses, instead, to stay. The city felt different when Sophie returned to it. Not louder, not darker, just sharper, as if the edges she had once ignored were now impossible to miss. The apartment Lorenzo had arranged for her sat high above the river, quiet and guarded but intentionally unadorned. No excess, no subtle reminders of ownership. It was the first place since the night of the bullet that felt like it belonged to her. She had chosen it. The boys were safe elsewhere, moved again before dawn. Their location known only to a handful of men Lorenzo trusted without question. The distance was necessary. Temporary. Painful in a way Sophie hadn't expected. She had not realized how deeply their presence had settled into her until it was gone. Lorenzo visited late that evening. He arrived without an entourage, without ceremony. He stood in the doorway as if waiting for permission, the city lights outlining him in fractured gold. Sophie noticed, with a quiet ache, how deliberate he was now, how carefully he occupied space around her. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I did," he replied simply. They sat across from each other in the dim living room, the hum of the city rising and falling beneath the windows. The war had not ended. It had shifted. Lorenzo's cousin had gone silent, which in their world was never a good sign. Pieces were moving into place, invisible but relentless. "I won't ask you to stay," Lorenzo said after a moment. "Not like this." Sophie studied his face, the tension held carefully in check. "Then what are you asking?" His gaze did not waver. "I'm asking you to let me be honest." She nodded once. "There will be blood," he said. "There will be choices I make that you won't agree with. I won't pretend otherwise. I won't soften it for you." His jaw tightened. "If that's something you can't live beside, I need to know now." The weight of the words pressed against her chest, heavy but clean. No manipulation, no false promises. "I don't need you to be someone else," Sophie said quietly. "I need you to know who you are when you choose to stand next to me." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, sharp and vulnerable. "I don't know how to offer you safety," Lorenzo admitted. "Only truth." "That's enough," she replied. "If it's real." Silence stretched between them, not strained but searching. Outside, a siren wailed briefly before fading into the distance. "I want to see them," Sophie said finally. "The boys." Lorenzo exhaled slowly. "Tomorrow." They stood together at the door then, neither quite ready to end the night. Lorenzo hesitated, then reached out, stopping just short of touching her. "Tell me if I cross a line," he said. "I will." And for the first time, he believed it. The next day unfolded without violence, which felt almost unsettling. Sophie watched the boys run through the private garden of the townhouse where they were hiding. Their laughter tentative at first, then free. They threw themselves at her when they saw her, unburdened by questions adults struggled to answer. "You came back," one said. "I did," she replied, kneeling to meet them. "And I'm not going anywhere without saying goodbye properly again." Lorenzo watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. Sophie caught his eye and held it, steady and unflinching. The message passed between them without words. That evening, as the boys slept upstairs, Sophie and Lorenzo stood alone beneath the open sky. The city stretched endlessly around them, indifferent to love and war alike. "This will end soon," Lorenzo said, "one way or another." And after Sophie asked, he was quiet for a long moment. After, "I don't know." She smiled faintly. "That's honest." He turned to her then, fully, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the man beneath it. "I don't know how to promise you a future," he said. "Every promise I've ever made has been transactional, conditional." Sophie stepped closer. "Then, don't promise." His breath caught. "What? Don't promise me peace," she said. "Or forever, or safety. Promise me presence. Promise me that when it's hard, and it will be, you won't disappear behind power and silence." The simplicity of it struck him harder than any demand ever had. "I can do that," he said slowly. "I can stay." She reached for his hand then, not tentative, not fearful. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. In that moment, there was no contract, no oath spoken in blood or gold, only a choice, made with open eyes. Somewhere in the city, the last moves of a long, brutal game were being said. The storm had not passed. It was gathering itself for one final reckoning. But as Sophie stood beside Lorenzo, her hand in his, she understood something with sudden clarity. Happy endings were not made of perfect outcomes. They were made of two people who chose each other not because the world was safe, but because it was not. And when the final battle came, as she knew it would, she would not be watching from the sidelines. She would be standing exactly where she had always stood between what could be destroyed and what was still worth saving. The war ended without spectacle. There were no headlines, no dramatic announcements, no victory speeches delivered from marble balconies. In Lorenzo Duca's world, endings rarely announced themselves. They arrived quietly, in sealed rooms and unmarked graves, in the sudden absence of names that once carried weight. Sophie learned this on a gray morning when Lorenzo returned home just before dawn. He did not wake her. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing, as if confirming something fragile was still real. When he finally sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress shifted slightly, enough to pull her from sleep. She opened her eyes. "You're back," she said. "Yes." That was all he gave her. No details, no explanations. She did not ask. She saw the truth in the way his shoulders finally lowered, in the way the tension that had lived behind his eyes for weeks had loosened its grip. It was over. Not cleanly, not painlessly, but completely. Later that morning, the city felt lighter, though nothing outward had changed. Traffic moved. People hurried. Life continued, unaware it had been spared collateral damage by choices made in the dark. The boys came home that afternoon. They ran through the door like sunlight, louder than the house remembered being, their laughter echoing off walls that had once absorbed gunfire. Sophie dropped to her knees instinctively, catching them as they collided with her, their arms tight around her neck. "You're not leaving again," one of them said. "Not as a question." "No," she replied, her voice thick. "I'm not." Lorenzo watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He had won his war. But this was the part that mattered. In the weeks that followed, the house transformed. Not dramatically, subtly. Guards remained. But their presence softened, receding into routine rather than crisis. Doors stayed unlocked longer. Windows stayed open. Sophie brought small, human chaos into spaces once ruled by control books left on tables. Music played too loud in the afternoons. The boys' drawings taped unapologetically to pristine walls. Lorenzo did not stop her. He watched her instead, the way she spoke to his sons, without authority, but with certainty. The way she challenged him when he retreated into silence. The way she touched him without fear or reverence, only truth. One evening, months later, they stood together in the garden as the sun sank low. The boys chased each other across the grass, their laughter unburdened. "You could leave now," Lorenzo said quietly. "No one would stop you." Sophie smiled faintly. "You've said that before. I mean it," he replied. "There are no debts left between us." She turned to face him fully. "That's why I'm staying." He studied her. The woman who had taken a bullet meant for his bloodline, who had seen his darkness and refused to turn it into a weapon. "I don't deserve this," he said. "No," she agreed gently. "You built something brutal to survive, but you're choosing something different now. And if I fail, then we face it," she said. Together, not hidden, not alone. The simplicity of it still astonished him. The wedding did not make headlines. There were no crowds, no cameras, no whispered speculation. It took place on a quiet morning, sunlight filtering through the trees. The ceremony attended only by those who mattered. Sophie wore a simple dress, chosen not for spectacle, but for comfort, for movement, for the life she intended to live inside it. Lorenzo stood waiting, not as a king, not as a ruler of shadows, but as a man who had learned the cost of love and chosen to pay it anyway. When Sophie reached him, there was no hesitation, no fear, only presence. The boys stood beside them, proud and solemn, their hands clutching petals they had been instructed to throw at exactly the right moment and not before. They obeyed for once. Years passed. The empire changed shape. It grew quieter, less visible. Lorenzo stepped back from what could not be softened and dismantled what could. Not redemption, evolution. Sophie did not become a queen of anything. She became the constant. The voice that asked the questions no one else dared. The calm in rooms that once thrived on intimidation. The reminder that power, when left unchecked, consumed itself. Sometimes, at night, they would sit together on the terrace, the city breathing beneath them. "Do you ever regret it?" Lorenzo asked once. Running toward that bullet, Sophie considered the question, the life that had unfolded from a single instinctive choice. "No," she said. "I regret that the world needed it, but not that I did it." He took her hand then, grounding himself in the warmth of something real. The bullet had been meant to end a future. Instead, it created one. Not perfect, not peaceful, but honest. And in a world built on darkness, that honesty became something rare and enduring, a light that had survived where violence had failed. Not because it was protected by power, but because two people had chosen to stand between what could destroy them and what they refused to lose. That was their happy ending. Not because the world became safe, but because, together, they became unafraid.